Dr. Andrew Swick is Director of Obesity and Eating Disorders Research at the Nutrition Research Institute, and he's here tonight to talk about obesity. It's not easy being lean. With over 20 years of experience in the study of obesity, Dr. Swick is a leading expert in the field. Dr. Swick earned a BS in Animal Science from the University of Florida in 1981. Then he got his master's in nutrition from the University of Nebraska in 1982. After earning his Ph.D. in 1987, Dr. Swick pursued postdoctoral research at the Lineberger Cancer Research Institute at UNC Chapel Hill. In 1990, he joined the Department of Biological Chemistry at Johns Hopkins University Medical Center and later moved on to Pfizer Global Research and Development as a senior research scientist in cardiovascular and metabolic diseases, working on diabetes and obesity. At Pfizer, Dr. Swick quickly advanced to become senior director of the cardiovascular, metabolic, and endocrine diseases. Excuse me, I'm working on your slide, aren't I, with my finger? Dr. Swick is an elected member of several professional organizations and is currently serving on the New York Academy of Sciences Diabetes and Obesity Steering Committee. After having spent several years leading research at Pfizer, Dr. Swick joined the NRI team in August of 2010. At the NRI, Dr. Swick and his team study the relationship between the digestive system and the regulation of body weight, appetite, and metabolism. So tonight you're going to hear about the relationship as well as the influence of genetics on energy expenditure and the effects of diet. Here's the fun part. He has 2 dogs, 2 birds. Do both of them talk, Dr. Swick, or just one? Your birds. Both talk. 3 kids, and 1 daughter is a runner at Davidson. 1 hamster. He said he was doing obesity research before it was cool. We could probably write a country song about that, couldn't we? Since the 1980s, and he sort of just fell into it by chance. He has 10 patents on obesity-related drugs. Get this, he actually enjoys exercise. He's like that little brown mouse that Dr. Zeisel shows us, the one that runs all the time and doesn't eat a lot. He eats right, too. So we are so glad to welcome Dr. Andrew Swick tonight to the podium.
I didn't eat that well today, and I didn't exercise. But. So what I'm going to do is talk to you about obesity from the standpoint of the epidemic of obesity. So most of you know, it's on, okay. Most of you know that there's an epidemic of obesity ongoing in the U.S., in the world, and with children, and I'll go through some of that. Talk about the physiology of body weight regulation. Give you a sense on how your body regulates weight through food intake and energy expenditure, and then spend some time talking about causes of obesity. There's a lot of interesting science that's been going on trying to describe or explain why obesity is increasing at such an alarming rate, including environmental factors that may contribute. And then we'll have some question and answers at the end that I look forward to. This slide has a depiction of, it's actually a graffiti from, I never remember if this is from New York or Los Angeles, doesn't really matter. But I always put this up because you basically can't go anywhere without reading about obesity. It's on the cover of magazines, it's in newspapers. If you go to the bookstore, I think the two biggest sections of books are books on how to lose weight and books on how to get rich. And if one of them worked, there'd only be one book. So with that in mind, I want to first describe what obesity actually is. Let me note that some of your slides, they're in order, but I took out some slides because I felt like maybe there were too many. And I still have a lot of slides, but I'll warn you, I grew up in New York. I could talk fast if I need to, so I'll probably get through all of them. By definition, obesity really just means an excess of adipose tissue or an excess of fat. and excess to the point where you're at increased risk for disease and increased risk for death. But the way that it's actually calculated and commonly described in the medical practice is through defining BMI, or body mass index, which many of you may be familiar with. So what body mass index is basically it's the ratio of your weight in pounds to your height and multiplied by a certain factor. And using those numbers, it can be determined whether you're at a healthy weight, overweight, or obese. And as an example, I don't know if you could see the numbers that well on your sheets or on the slides. I'll use myself as an example to just put things in perspective, because one of the things I always find is that people think they know what obesity is, but you really don't know what it is. And overweight as well is important to understand. So for someone like me that's 6 feet tall, if I was considered to be overweight, it'd be at 180 pounds, which doesn't seem like a lot. Personally, to me, I don't feel like that's a lot. So between 180 pounds and 210 pounds, someone that's 6 feet tall would be considered overweight. If you're over 210 pounds, you'd be considered obese. And so this is a guide that's used in the medical profession to help people understand where they are and where they need to be for health reasons. Now, this isn't hard and fast, and there are examples of people that have high BMIs that are not obese. And I used this example even before I was in North Carolina, but I always say that Michael Jordan in his prime had a BMI of 26, 27 at times. I don't think most people would consider him overweight. We shared a BMI. So I mean, you can have a high BMI and not be overweight, but in general, your BMI tracks with your excess adiposity, and most importantly, with your risk for disease and death. So what I want to take you through are a series of slides that are just, it's from the CDC, and they're just pictures of the United States. And as we move on, it'll show you how the increase in obesity, it'll depict the increase in obesity that's occurred in the last 20 to 30 years. This slide starts out in 1985, and the legend, what it describes is in very light blue, it's if your BMI or you're considered obese, about 10% of the population in that state. If 10 to 14% were considered obese, then it would be the darker blue. And I'll go through these slides fairly quickly, but what you'll see is that when you go from Carolina blue to Duke blue, it starts to increase. It means obesity is increasing. Eventually, we'll end up with NC State, and it has nothing to do with the schools. It's just that to keep that in mind as we go through. And you'll see how the incidence, again, although you know there's an epidemic and you've read a lot about it, even to audiences in the nutrition and obesity field, I always like to show these slides because it's striking as to how it increased so rapidly. So that was 1985, 1986. So 5 years later, you can see how much more of the country has turned Carolina blue. Now we have, in 1990, actually, there was now states where 15 to 19% of the population, of the adult population, were obese. Go to 93. Now about half a little over half the United States, states in the United States had obesity rates of greater than 15 to 19%. And now we start to see in 1997, so this is only 12 years. In 12 years, we start to see obesity rates at over 20% in many states, or at least in a few states. And that continues to increase. So we get to where we are now in 2010. And you can see we went from initially in 1985 with some states having obesity rates of 10 to 14% to the minimal obesity rate now being about 20 to 24%, with many states having over 30% of the adult population being obese. So it's important to just understand this, that the obesity rate is increasing at an alarming rate. And although it's more in certain areas of the country than others, they seem to be following each other. So at this point, about 60% of the adult U.S. population are either overweight or obese. And although this is an area where the United States is actually leading the world with some competition, not something we want to be doing, but obesity is also increasing in the rest of the world. And if you just look at the colors, the right panel, I believe, is for males. The left panel is for women. You could see that the obesity is a problem worldwide, with the exception of a few areas where undernutrition is a bigger issue. And in fact, in the last 2 or 3 years, it's been determined that worldwide that overnutrition is a bigger problem or more prevalent than undernutrition is. And in China, where obesity had not been a problem for many years, it's estimated the obesity rates will double from 2005 to 2015. So obesity is increasing in the United States and the rest of the world, and very importantly in children as well. If you look at the rates of obesity over the last 15, 20 years, or 30 years, you could see that the increase, in fact, from 1980, prevalence among children and adolescents has almost tripled. So 3 times as many children are obese and adolescents are obese than they were in 1980. And now there's about almost 20% of the children and adolescents ages 12 to 19 in the United States are obese. And this is really striking and important, because along with the obesity, and I'll get into some of the comorbidities and the diseases associated with obesity, it's being seen in children at younger and younger ages. And so why do we care about obesity? Well, what I just said is that obesity is a disease into itself, but also there are comorbidities and other diseases that are associated with obesity. And in fact, this has been known for thousands of years. In fact, Hippocrates had said made a statement about that obesity is a disease unto itself that also is basically a risk factor or associated with many other diseases too. So this is not known, but is not new, but the number of diseases that it's associated with has increased. And so many of the diseases that you're most familiar with associated with obesity are diabetes, metabolic diseases, dyslipidemia, hypertension, heart disease. However, there are other very important diseases that also increase in the face of obesity. Pulmonary diseases such as asthma, sleep apnea. Sleep apnea, maybe many of you are familiar with. I guess I would term it as intense snoring, where you actually stop breathing intermittently. And in fact, of all the comorbidities and the diseases, that's one of the ones that is one of the highest concerns because of quality of life. And usually it's the spouse that wants something to get done about that. But there's also increases in certain osteoarthritis and other types of diseases. And as you go across the spectrum of obesity, so from a BMI of 25 to 29.9, which is just overweight, all the way up to severe obesity, the risk continues to increase. And I think that's really an important point too, is that it's not just when you get to the point of obesity, but when you get above the healthy weight, a lot of these comorbidities and diseases will increase. And as I mentioned, the disease most closely associated with obesity is diabetes. Most people understand that with obesity, diabetes is a very high risk. In fact, 90% of type 2 diabetics are obese or overweight, and if they lost weight, it was thought that they would not be diabetic anymore. So that's 90%. What this slide represents is on the top are the increases in obesity from 1994 to 2000 to 2008, and then the increases in diabetes along the bottom. And the reason I show you that is that you can see how the diabetes tracks with obesity. It's a little bit further behind because it takes a a little bit of time of being obese before diabetes sets in, but you can see that it tracks pretty closely, and there's many states now where greater than 10% of the adult population has diabetes. And while much of the focus has always been associated with obesity and metabolic type diseases, things like that, there's a lot of evidence that obesity is also a risk factor for cancer. And for those of you that were here for the first presentation by Dr. Zeisel, I know that you've heard a lot about nutrition and cancer, so I won't belabor the point. But I want to point out just some of the cancers that are specifically associated with obesity. In the first column, this is with the relative risk of getting these cancers based on being overweight. The second column is based on being obese. And what a relative risk means that is basically if two people were virtually identical and the only difference was obesity or body weight, it's the risk that you would get this disease. So it's the contribution of obesity or overweight to that disease. And so you can see for things like endometrial cancer, it's 3.5 times greater, which is a tremendously greater risk for getting that type of cancer. Colon cancers are 1.5 to 2%, two times increased, and other diseases such as liver cancer are up to 4-fold increased in obese and overweight people. The last two columns, I'll just have you focus on the one that says PAF % for U.S. population. What that statistic is, basically, is what percentage of the people that have those cancers is it believed it is attributed to by obesity or overweight. And you can see that it's just tremendous. Again, endometrial cancer, over half of the endometrial cancers are believed to be a result of obesity and overweight. Esophageal cancer as well. So you can, if you flip the equation around, what you'd be saying is that you could eliminate half of these cancers if obesity and overweight were not a problem. Scientifically, we're still trying to understand how obesity leads to these conditions. And I'll just share some of the data and information on that with you now. So one of the things we know that happens with obesity is that there's an increase in inflammation. So inflammation from the excess adipose tissue, there's cytokines and other factors that are released by the adipose tissue that lead to increase in, for example, diabetes, which is associated with inflammation. Some of the arthritises, the heart disease, are all associated with increased inflammation, which we believe is largely due to the excess adipose tissue because it produces these inflammatory types of proteins. But there's also evidence that the intestines contribute to that as well. So there's an increase in the amount of inflammatory factors that are produced in response to obesity. These also contribute to the risk of cancer, but two other factors that are very important with respect to the link between obesity and cancer are two proteins that actually are produced by fat. So for many years, and as was pointed out, I've been doing obesity research, I feel like, for my entire life. But for many years, we thought of adipose tissue as just a storage for fat. It was really thought to be an inert tissue that excess energy, excess calories, and fat were stored, but really didn't have much of an effect. Now we know that adipose tissue produces hormones and other factors that regulate other aspects of metabolism and have other implications as far as disease. One factor or hormone termed leptin is produced by fat cells, and the more fat cells you have and the bigger fat cells, more leptin is produced. Leptin is associated with increased cancer cell growth and increased, it contributes to the development of cancer. On the other hand, adiponectin, which is also produced by adipose tissue, actually decreases with obesity, and it's thought to have a protective effect on cancer. So what happens in the obese state is basically you cause an imbalance. So the pro-cancer type of hormone is increasing, and the other hormone, which is more protective, seems to decrease. So with all the increased risk of and the comorbidities and diseases associated with obesity, it's not surprising that the economic cost of obesity is tremendous. For the individual, on an individual basis, and this is not necessarily personal cost, but it's estimated that it costs up to $8,000 per year for each adult that is obese. And in the slide on the graph on the left, it's been estimated that on an annual basis, obesity costs the United States about $450 billion per year. And that includes about $160 billion in direct medical costs, and then the rest are in indirect costs due to decreased work, short-term disabilities, and other things like that. So I wouldn't get caught up on the exact number because there's lots of ways that they're estimated, but they're all about to come in around this number. And so basically it was $500 billion per year is attributed or spent due to obesity. And to put that in perspective, with the like the NIH budget, so the National Institutes of Health budget for all research, not just for obesity, but for all research, is only around $30 billion. And when you look at what that means in terms of the percent of medical costs, and, especially with the rising healthcare costs, all the concerns about Medicare, Medicaid, and private insurance costs, it's estimated, and this was back in 2006, and we know it's increased even further than that obesity accounts for about 12 to 13% of all medical costs, as far as with private insurance as well as with Medicaid. So it's a very significant impact, not only from a health perspective, but from an economic perspective. And of course, as money, there's only so much money to be distributed, so that affects other diseases as well. And then, most importantly, what does this mean in terms of overall life expectancy and as well as quality of life? So obesity in the last year or two surpassed cigarette smoking as the leading cause of preventable death in the United States. By preventable death means that I guess I would say theoretically there's something that you can do about it. So that again, if obesity was not a problem in the United States, the number of deaths would decrease from that, and it's now the leading cause of preventable death. And if you look at the graph that's there, what that depicts is your relative risk of dying based on your BMI. And so if you look at the 20 to 25, that's considered the healthy range of BMI. Overweight is 25 to 30, so you can see even within that, there's an increased risk of death related to being obese or overweight. And when you get to the very high, it's over a threefold increase. And again, this is the relative risk means if you took two people and you were comparing them and they were similar in every other way, or identical, I should say, the person that was obese would have a 3 times greater risk of dying. So with that, what do we do about it? And again, there's serious consequences for obesity, but the good news is that even modest decreases in body weight or body fat will lead to improvements in cardiovascular risk, diabetes prevention, quality of life, and some of the other comorbidities, as well as decreasing mortality. And this is something I just want to stress, is that for someone that's obese, you don't have to get back down to your high school weight to reap the benefits. So a 5 or 10% decrease in body weight that's sustained will lead to significant improvements in health. So I think that it's overwhelming to a lot of people as far as trying to lose a significant amount of weight, but 5 to 10% decreases in body weight that's sustained lead to significant improvements in comorbidities and quality of life. And if there's science behind that, and we understand a little bit about how that actually occurs. And in the Q&A, if people have questions, we can discuss that. So now I want to get into I guess I call it the mathematics of body weight. So how is body weight regulated from a mathematical standpoint, which is actually quite simple? In order to maintain your weight, you simply have to intake or eat the same number of calories that you burn off each day. If you're in positive energy balance, meaning that you eat more calories than you burn off, you're going to gain weight. And if you eat less calories than you burn off, you're going to lose weight. So mathematically, that's a pretty simple equation. But most people in the obesity field and most people that have tried to lose weight know that that's not necessarily that easy. And I should point out too that when I say that, that is relative to what your energy requirements are. So I just want to go through an example of to kind of put this in a real life perspective of what this actually means. So the first thing that I like to point out is that if an adult ate 2,000 calories per day, which is not a high calorie diet, but it's recommended, it's within the range of recommended calories for most adults, that in a 20-year period, you would eat over 14 million calories. If you had an imbalance of 1% over that 20-year period, you would gain 40 pounds. So it just shows you that, I mean, again, this is mathematical, but from a mathematical perspective, it's very easy to gain weight. I mean, a 1% error is nothing. And I'll give you a more real-life example. So everyone sees these 100-calorie packs of cookies and thinks, well, I'm going to eat those, and those are good. And it is a way to kind of control your calorie intake. But as an example, a 120-pound woman that was 5'4", if she overeats based on her calorie needs by 100 calories per day, in 10 years, it's not good. She would gain 100 pounds. And I'm not picking on women. This is true for men, children, everybody. Anybody that overeats by 100 calories per day, which if you've eaten those packs of cookies, it's not a lot. You would gain 100 pounds in 10 years. On the positive side, if you underate by 100 calories per day over 10 years, you would lose 100 pounds. So with that, and I said mathematical probably 30 times in the last few slides, because that is all mathematical, and physiologically, it's quite different. So what happens when you try to, because the actual calorie requirements for an individual are different, and they vary depending on the circumstances, including exercise, diet, etc., age. And so what happens with diet, so when you selectively try to decrease your energy intake by decreasing food, the amount of energy that you need actually goes down. So when I was talking about before that if you're eating 100 calories over your requirement actually goes down when you try to diet. And that's why many people lose weight kind of rapidly and then you plateau, because there's a constant challenge to physiologically, your body is trying to maintain the weight that it had before. On the other hand, if you try to exercise just by itself, you get hungry. So the desire to eat is more. And again, the drive is for your physiology and your body to try to maintain your energy or your weight as where it was before. And I think the rationale or the reason why this happens is that we weren't really, if you look at the changes that have occurred over the last 20 years versus what happened for the last several thousand years, is that we used to go and collect food, so you were working to get that food. Food wasn't always that common, so you had to work hard to do that. So you're exercising and probably not eating that much. And there wasn't really a lot of need for physiology to worry about what happens if you overeat. It's only been in the last 10, 15 years where it's been a problem, where now when we go hunt, we get in our car, we drive to the grocery store, we go inside and we forage in the shelves and then drive back home. So we're not exercising and we're not working to get our food, and it's too plentiful. So the calorie needs of an individual, as I said before, they're individual needs, but we like to think of at least ranges for most people. And what you can see in this slide is that the average calorie needs, and this is for a population, can't always be applied to an individual, vary depending on your level of activity. And with activity, it will always go up. And then it also depends on your age. But you can see that the range is around 2,000 calories for adult women. And with men, it's more in the 2,400 to 2,600 range. And although these numbers are used, and it's a great guidance for how many calories you should be consuming, I just wanted to point out that there's tremendous variability in what requirements are for people. And this is driven by genetics as well as other things. And just to share some data that we generated in our lab at the NRI. So the pictures on top are, we have a room where people can stay for up to 24 hours, and we can measure their actual energy requirement to within 50 to 75 calories. And so this data just represents a study where we had predicted energy requirements based on a measurement of lean body mass. So for the most part, adipose tissue doesn't use a lot of energy. It's more of a storage. Most energy is burned and calories required due to lean muscle, internal organs, brain, etc. So when we did this study, we calculated their energy expenditure based on how much lean body mass they had, but you could see their actual energy expenditure is quite varied. And so even for two people with the same lean body mass, the requirement can vary by 200 to 300 calories. And so what are the components of energy expenditure? Why do you burn calories? So for the most part, it's to keep your organs functioning and to keep your body warm. And in fact, small animals have higher rates of energy expenditure because their surface area is much greater compared to their body weight, and so they lose a lot of heat. For adults, energy expenditure can be broken up by different compartments. And we often refer to resting energy expenditure. That means basically you're not exercising, you're pretty sedentary, and you're just sitting, and that contributes the majority of how much energy most people will require. On top of that, when you eat food, there's something called the thermic effect of food. So energy or calorie burn increases due to the actual food that you're eating. It's the digestion process, the chewing process, et cetera. And then on top of that, the most variable is the activity energy expenditure. And the reason I show you this is that for the most part, it's the activity energy expenditure is the one that you can change most readily. And that's through exercise. The panel on the right is again data from one of the studies that we ran at the NRI in our metabolic chamber, and I just want to show you what that looks like in real life. So this was postmenopausal women over a 24-hour period, and you could see that for the first part is when they're awake. Breakfast was at 2 hours, and you can see the thermic effect of food. So their energy expenditure actually goes up when they ate. It goes up at lunch, and it goes up again at dinner. And then when they go to sleep, you can see that energy expenditure goes down. And this is true for everybody, and this is what contributes to the total amount of energy that's required. So diving down a little bit into the physiology of how this all occurs. So how does your body know how much energy to burn? When are you hungry? when are you satiated, and of course, humans can overcome this because of the comfort foods and foods that you're used to eating and things like that. But there are signals that actually tell you when you're satiated and when you're hungry. And for quite a number of years, it was all thought that it was in the brain, that your brain controlled everything. It controlled what you ate, when you ate, if you were hungry, not hungry, how many calories you burned. But now we know it's much more complicated than that. And in fact, many organs within the body contribute to the hunger signals, as well as the energy requirements, as well as the specific types of foods that you may desire. And on the slide, as I mentioned before, there's adipose tissue, which now we know is much more active, is involved in that. The pancreas, the liver, the small intestine, and these signals do get integrated, though, in the brain. So the brain is still very, very key and has a prominent role, but there's sensors throughout the body that regulate and signal the hunger, satiety, and energy expenditure. In particular, I wanted to just show you a slide of the gut or the intestine for two reasons. One, it's an area that's becoming much more understood as far as a role in food intake, and it's also something that we study in our lab as well. So for years it was thought that the intestines basically were just where food went in and it got absorbed and it really didn't do very much. But now we know that the intestines have many cells that actually produce hormones, just like I said about adipose tissue. They produce hormones that regulate, they're involved in diabetes, they're involved in regulating food intake, energy expenditure, et cetera. And recently it's also been found that taste receptors, so on your tongue, you know how there's taste receptors for sweet, salt, hot, things like that. They're also in the intestine, along with other mechanisms. So what we think happens is that food actually gets sensed as you're digesting it. And when it's getting sensed, it will respond by secreting hormones and adjusting your appetite. Some of the work that we've done, that I did at Pfizer and we continue to look at here, is how fat metabolism in the intestine actually regulates food intake. And so the way to think about it is that your intestine is really, the inside of your intestine is really outside your body. It's a tube. And you don't really, the food doesn't really get in until it gets absorbed. And so there's a lot of mechanisms in there and ways to sense and signal, again, integrated in the brain as to what, whether you should be hungry, satiated, even choices of food as to whether it'll influence whether you want to eat fat or carbohydrates. So now I want to move on to the incidence of obesity, the increasing incidence of obesity. So why is obesity increasing? I think the slides I showed you at the beginning were very convincing that from 1985 to 2010, obesity rates have just skyrocketed. So why is that? Well, we basically like to think of it in two worlds. It's genetics and the environment. So the genetics of obesity is still not well understood, but there's a lot of information now so that we understand the genes that may be involved in body weight regulation. It's thought that there may be actually up to 6,000 genes involved in regulating body weight. And although that sounds like a high number, if you think about it, it should be a high number because it's required for survival. If you don't eat, you're not gonna live, and you're so it makes sense as far as that's concerned. Heritability of obesity is 50 to 70%. So what that means is that you can explain about 50 to 70% of a person's body weight based on their genetics, which means basically half of it you can't explain by genetics. And the way that I like to explain it is that the genetics basically set your parameters. They set the range with which you're most likely to be. And then it's the environment that will determine whether you're at the upper end or the lower end. And so when we think about the rapid increase in obesity, we know that it can't be explained by primary genetic changes. So within the DNA, the sequence of the DNA itself, it changes very slowly. And so over 15, 20 years, there have not been enough changes to mandate a dramatic increase in body weight. There are modifications of genes that occur that probably do have a big influence, but at least the primary genetic blueprint for everybody has not changed enough to cause that. And it's interesting to point out that it's not just humans that are getting bigger, but in this study where they looked at over 20,000 different types of animals, animals were also getting bigger. And so this included feral animals, domestic animals, laboratory animals. And so there's this trend towards increasing body weight that goes beyond humans. And so what I'm going to take you through in the next set of slides is to give you examples of what some of these factors could be that may be contributing to this increase. So basically, I like to call it's the interface between the genetics and the environment. So the two things that most people think about in terms of why is there obesity, why is the obesity increase, is that people say, well, we're eating more, or we're eating higher calorie, or we're eating bad food, and we're exercising less. And so when you look at the food that's currently being consumed in the U.S., there's about 63% of calories are coming from processed foods. And that's a large increase compared to what had happened in the past. And when you look specifically at over time, so from 1970 to 2004, on the left side is for men, and on the right side for women. This looks at the macronutrient content of diet, so protein, carbohydrate, fat, and what's actually happened. And so interestingly, for both the men and the women, protein intake has actually decreased a little bit, if anything. Fat intake has also decreased a little bit. Now, I'm not talking about the specific types of fat, but just in general, fat has decreased. But what has increased is carbohydrates. And so I'm not saying that carbohydrates are bad. This is just an observation. There are some that feel that refined carbohydrates, soft drinks, things like that, have made a tremendous contribution to obesity. But it's interesting when you look at the changes that have occurred with respect to diet, the only big change that's occurred is that carbohydrates have gone up. And we know too, though, that with those carbohydrates, the amount of refined carbohydrates has gone up relative to the amount of unrefined carbohydrates, such as fruits and vegetables and things like that. So as I said before too, the two biggest things that people argue about is it food intake or is it activity? Well, activity has decreased. We all know that within schools that gym programs and exercise programs have decreased. And like I said before, we don't walk to the grocery store very much. We drive, we park close. So there's not a lot of activity that occurs. And if you actually look at these two maps, the map on the left is the percent of physical inactivity, and this was defined by the CDC. And then look at the obesity rates on the right side, and you can see they go hand in hand. The less active people are, the higher the higher the rate of obesity is. So when people have this discussion about whether it's, and people ask me this all the time, is it the food or is it exercise? I say yes. Another interesting area that that more is being learned about is the maternal influence on childhood disease. So when we think about the environment, you also have to consider the intrauterine environment that where development is occurring. And what's known is that can very heavily influence the future for the child. So, for example, in the presence of maternal obesity or overnutrition, there's increased inflammation, as we discussed before, insulin resistance, fat breakdown, and that leads to a reprogramming of some of the genes involved in metabolism, and this can occur in utero. And ultimately what happens is this leads to an increased risk of diabetes, obesity, fatty liver disease in the offspring. And so that's also a very important environment, and it's an area that's being studied pretty intensely right now. And it goes back to what I mentioned about epigenetics. So it's thought that epigenetics plays a role in this, that actually there's modifications to the genes that occur, that can occur more rapidly, and that these get carried on and they can be passed on. But I want to give you two other examples of observations that have been made due to unfortunate events. First is the Great Chinese Famine that occurred in 1958 through 1961, where very limited food supplies were available to the Chinese population. In addition, during World War II, the hunger winter, which occurred in about 1944, that there was limited food supplies for those people in Holland as well. And the estimates are that people were consuming about 500 calories per day for a prolonged period of time. And what was found is that when they looked at children who were born to the same parents either before the famine or the hunger winter and after the famine and the hunger winter, what was found was that children born during that period when there was deprivation, those children had a higher risk, a higher incidence of obesity as they got older. And also there's some data suggesting a higher rate of schizophrenia as well, which is interesting. So you think, why would that happen? Well, as I said before, the DNA, the basic DNA does not change that rapidly, but epigenetics can actually allow some adaptation to occur more quickly. And you think about if a child was, or if the intrauterine environment was such where there was not that many calories, in order for this, when the baby's born to be survived, they adapted to live in an environment where there wouldn't be that many calories. That's one of the hypotheses which I think makes sense to me. But subsequently, they were in an environment where there were significant calories. So the intrauterine environment is clearly very important in subsequent outcomes in children that are when they're born. So what about other environmental factors? So do viruses cause obesity? Most people probably would laugh, say, well, yeah, that'd be nice, but I really don't think it's a virus. However, there is data that suggests that viruses may be involved in body weight. This first comes from studies with chickens. So there's a certain virus in chickens. When they get it, they become obese. That might be good for making soup, but other than that, not healthy for the chickens. And so based on that work, what people did was look at a similar type of virus. And they found that if this virus is administered to monkeys, that they actually become obese. And that's the graph at the bottom. So administration of this virus leads to increased body weight. In humans, of course, you can't expose people to virus to do a study to see whether they're going to become obese. But when blood samples have been studied to see is there any correlation between those that have been exposed to this similar type of virus and body weight, there seems to be a correlation. And I should just point out that it's not the same virus, and you will not get this virus from eating chicken. I don't want to get a call from Chick-fil-A or anything. So, but it's just an interesting correlation. And then for those of you that came to Dr. Spencer's talk a couple weeks ago, she talked about gut microbes. And so we know that there's 10 times more microbes in our body than there are cells in our body. So what do? Well, there's data to suggest that the gut microbes actually can alter body weight. And so depending on what type of microbes are present in the intestinal tract, it can change whether somebody, or it is correlated with whether somebody's tends to be obese or not. In animal studies, they've actually shown that if they take these bacteria and they give them to animals, they can actually show differences in body weight. Whether that'll be totally true for humans or not, we don't really know. But I think there's reason to believe that gut microbes probably play some role in body weight regulation. The reason the way they do that probably is due to absorption. So the bacteria will actually digest some of the food that has not been previously digested, and depending on their efficiency of that will either increase, that could increase the amount of food that you actually get absorbed, that you've eaten. There's lots of chemicals that are used in different types of materials. I'm sure that bisphenol is something that most of you are familiar with. It's been in the literature because it's in certain types of plastic, and now a lot of plastic containers, water bottles will say does not contain bisphenol. But the point is that there are a number of different environmental chemicals that may be playing a role in obesity as well. And the way that most of these work is that they bind to receptors in cells. Now, the receptors in the cells activate lots of different genes and change metabolism, which can change your energy expenditure and can change your appetite, and can regulate fat cell development, body weight, as well as insulin levels. And in this one study in a Mexican population looking at dioxin, they showed that if you look at the BMI versus the amount of dioxin present in people's blood, that there was a correlation with those that had higher levels of dioxin had increased BMIs. So again, does this mean that chemicals cause obesity and dioxin causes obesity? No, but it's another factor within the environment, aside from food and exercise, which we know which is really important, that could affect body weight. Another important factor is temperature, so environmental temperature. If you expose people or animals, this is actually a slide depicting the human response. If you're at very cold temperatures, as you know, you shiver. Shivering is exercise, and that burns a lot of calories. But if you're below shivering and still cool or cold, your body produces more energy to keep you warm. And so at lower temperatures, you burn more calories. When you're in a thermal neutral zone, which is temperatures where you don't really need to make that much extra heat to keep you warm, there's not an increase in energy expenditure. And actually, if you get to the other extreme, or if it's really hot, then energy expenditure goes up because of the activity of sweating. So what does that really mean? In this study that was done at the University of Alabama, they took mice and they exposed them at two different temperatures. The 27 degree is a higher temperature, which is closer to their what's termed thermoneutrality. So they'd be on that flat part of the line that I just showed you before. So they really wouldn't need to produce that much heat to keep warm. At 22 degrees, which they can live fine, they won't shiver, but it's below their thermoneutrality, and they're going to need to produce heat to keep warm. So at 27 degrees, this is a picture basically of it's called a DEXA scan, which looks at body composition. And you can see that the animal housed at the higher temperature was obese. It had a higher amount of body fat. And so the rationale being that they didn't need to burn off that much energy or to burn energy in order to keep warm. Now, I'm not recommending that everybody turns down the temperature of their house to try to lose weight, but it's something that people have talked about. But then, if you remember what I was said earlier, is that if you exercise, you tend to get hungrier, and this will also, cold weather does tend to increase appetite. In humans, there's been similar types of studies done. Now, in humans, there's a special type of adipose tissue called brown adipose tissue, which actually its role is to produce heat. Newborns have a lot of it, and in fact, there's a spike when they're born, and that's what's thought to keep their body temperature. But adults, it's controversial as to how much and how important brown adipose actually is. But in this study, where they actually measured or visualized brown adipose tissue, and in response to cold exposure, the people that had brown adipose tissue visible, based on the analysis that was done, had an increase in energy expenditure in response to cold, whereas those that did not have visible brown adipose tissue did not have an increase in energy expenditure. So this goes hand in hand with some data too, suggesting that in response to overfeeding or eating extra calories, some people have a tendency to be able to burn those calories off better than others. Some, the calories just get packed on. Others are able to burn that off. And it's thought to be a similar mechanism to what happens when you're exposed to cold. And then the other, or another interesting observation as to what's leading, what are the causes of the obesity epidemic, are sleep. So I know that when I was growing up, it was always thought, well, if you sleep too much, you're lazy, and you're not out, you're not being active, you're not working too hard. But what studies have shown is that actually you need a sufficient amount of sleep, restorative sleep to repair your what's happened during the day, et cetera. And what's been shown is that for people that sleep 5 hours a day versus 8 hours a day, and these are actually measured sleep, because a lot of people tend to underreport the amount that they sleep. They say, oh, I work so hard, I'm tired, I only sleep this many hours. This is actual measured hours of sleep. They showed that for people that had less sleep, so when they were sleeping 5 hours versus 8 hours per day, they had an increased BMI. And the biology behind this, not totally understood, but two things that that's been observed are, one is that leptin, which I mentioned before, is produced by fat, and actually increases energy expenditure, goes down. So the amount of energy they're going to expend would decrease. Ghrelin, which is a hormone produced by the stomach, actually causes appetite, and it rises before meals, and that's one of the main drivers to make you hungry. It actually goes up. And so these hormone changes leading to increased hunger and decreased energy expenditure, together with the fact that when you're tired, you're going to be less active, come together to probably explain why not enough sleep may actually be a risk for increased body weight. So with all that, the conclusion is that there are likely many factors and causes of obesity. We went through a lot of them: the microbes, viruses. I didn't touch upon drugs. There's many, or a set of drugs that people take for different conditions that actually we know cause body weight increases. There's the effects of exercise, sleep, toxins, et cetera, and that many of these factors probably come together, depending on the individual and depending on the genetics and other things going on, to contribute to the incidence of obesity. However, what I like to leave you with is that at the end of the day, the bottom line is that it doesn't really matter, because obesity results from chronic energy imbalance or overnutrition, and while these factors may be involved and it's not clear how much each of them are involved, they're interesting to think about, but really it's chronic positive overnutrition or energy balance that leads to obesity. So I wanted to leave you with a positive note at the end. So as I mentioned before, many people, or most people, can lose weight, but it's very difficult to keep weight off. And in fact, I've talked to people that have said they've lost 150, 200 pounds in their life, yet they weigh more now than they did before, because you lose 40, you gain 50, you lose 30, you gain 40. However, although it's extremely difficult, it's not impossible. And in order to be successful, I would actually say that dieting doesn't work, because dieting is really a short-term fix. Really, it's dieting and a lifestyle change that's going to lead to a positive outcome. And it's important to focus on both sides of the energy expenditure equation. So you need to decrease calorie intake relative to energy expenditure and increase energy expenditure. And then the other important point is to, again, don't feel like you need to get back to a high school weight to reap health benefits. In general, body weight does increase over time as we age, but modest weight loss will improve your metabolic profile and your overall health. And so in the last slide is just a lifestyle thing. So the bicycle runs on fat, saves you money. The car runs on money, makes you fat. And with the current prices of gas, it's going to run out of a lot of money quickly. So with that, that was my last slide. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Yeah, so those are interesting points. I'll try to remember all of them, but I'll go in reverse order. So overnutrition means over calories, and it's unlikely that most people are deficient eating. I mean, unless you're just eating potato chips, exclusively. But with a mixed diet, even an unhealthy mixed diet, nutrient deficiencies are not going to be very common. With respect to the quality of food, you should eat a healthy diet. Even if you're going to overeat, eat a healthy diet, because there are other benefits in a healthy diet that are going to be beneficial. The amount of calories you eat is very important. There's the science. So there's a lot of anecdotal data or information out there that people like to talk about. I'm sure every time somebody hears that that I study obesity, they say, "Oh, my cousin did this, and my uncle did this. I tried this. We know this works." And again, going back to the point I made earlier, that's why there's hundreds, thousands of books and programs to try to lose weight. And so there's a lot of anecdotal information out there. But as far as real scientific data, a lot of these anecdotal types of things are not really, they're not scientifically based right now. They could be true. And some of the work that we're doing and we're hoping to continue to do is actually to study those in a scientific lab and with the metabolic chamber, with measuring food intake, and say, okay, does it matter? Because for many years it was thought that it's just calories. I tend to believe that there's more to it than just calories. The type of calories may make a difference, and it's also going to depend on the individual as well. And so what our goal to do is to actually try to look at some of these things that make sense and run studies and see, does the science support the idea that if you only eat, if you get rid of refined carbs and you eat certain types of fat or certain types of vegetables and things like that, will that benefit you? So I think it's a, the bottom line, I guess I would say, is that the science isn't there on a lot of these things yet. We're hoping to contribute to that. But at the end of the day, is like, eat a healthy diet. Even if you're going to overeat, at least eat a healthy diet. That'll be beneficial. Okay. So do you have the handout? It's at the top. Yeah. Yeah, usually it's done in metric, but I changed it just to make it easier for everybody. Yeah, so when you lose weight, you will lose some. Repeat the question. The question is, when you diet and lose lean mass, do you lose lean mass, and what is that all about, basically? So when you diet, you will lose lean mass, because part of the lean mass is to carry the extra weight. So that would be expected. However, on a healthy diet with exercise, you will blunt some of that lean mass, and you should lose predominantly fat. So you should maintain lean mass. If you're dieting, exercising, and you're losing predominantly lean mass, it's not healthy, and it's not really beneficial. Yeah, so in general, it's being on a healthy diet that has adequate protein, and exercising with that. But if you had a body composition performed, and then you lose weight and you lose a little bit of lean mass, that's normal, because again, you're carrying around weight. You lost some of that weight, so you don't need the lean mass. But the percent body fat should drop. So your total lean mass may go down, but the percent lean mass should go up. Don't panic. No. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So the question was, what do you do about that? So what do you do about the lean mass loss that occurs with dieting, and is there any way to protect against that? Because the thought is lean mass is responsible for a lot of the energy requirement or energy burn, and if you're losing lean mass, is a battle that's difficult. So the reality is that a significant amount of, although lean mass does use a significant amount of energy, your internal organs also use a lot of energy, the heart, the brain, etc. And again, I wouldn't really worry about it, because if you're following a healthy diet and you're exercising and you're losing weight, your muscle mass that you do have will be more active as well. But it is one of the things that it's not necessarily the loss of lean mass that makes it maintaining weight loss difficult. It's just general decreases in metabolic rate, but you can offset those by exercising. Yes?
I had a question in regards to your slide here, maternal influence on childhood disease. And I was just thinking about mothers giving their children cells, and the evolution of not necessarily giving them cells to get fat, but the cells being more sensitive
Yeah, so the question is, why does your son not have wisdom teeth? No, the question is obesity increasing due to evolution?
And some kind of change in the cells, some kind of.
Right, yeah.
And they're not necessarily making the children fat, but making the children pick up the sugars and salts.
Yeah, so are there inherited changes in metabolism that are leading to obesity that are evolutionary? And so what I was, in some of the early slides I was showing you is that genetics, so when you think about it, evolutionary, genetics change pretty slowly. And so although we know that there was a demand over hundreds, thousands of years to be more efficient. And so the animals and people that survived were the ones that could live on less, and so are very efficient at putting on calories. And the analogy is farm animals. So farm animals have been selected over the years to be the most efficient because it's cheaper for the farmer to have animals that convert feed very efficiently to lean mass, milk, whatever that is, or egg production. So we know that there's a component of that. But in the short term, these changes, it's just not scientifically possible that in the last 100 years, 50 years, there's been this evolutionary change. And that's where the epigenetics is probably a more important component. And so what epigenetics are these changes to the DNA that can happen very rapidly, and they would happen in the maternal environment or the inner utero environment in response to what that environment is. So in the case of the hunger winter and the decreased food supply during the revolution in China, the thought is that there were changes made, so these slight modifications of the DNA. It's not the basic genetic blueprint, but it's changes that occur on that are more dynamic. So it allows you to adapt, or people and animals to adapt to more acute things, that those changes probably occurred, and there's data that they did occur, and that made those babies and as children more efficient at taking in food and putting on fat because they were born or being exposed to an environment where there was a calorie deficit. Does that answer your question? And then, like what you said about, not to make any more comments about wisdom teeth. I don't have wisdom teeth. My parents did. I feel like I'm more evolved than they are. But now my kids have wisdom teeth, so I don't know. But that's something where, over time, there's really no selection for needing that anymore. So there tends to be more and more people without having at least a full set of wisdom teeth. Same idea.
Is it possible for someone to be obese by definition and still be quote-unquote healthy if the person is exercising regularly and eating well?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the question is, can you be obese but otherwise healthy? And I was at a meeting yesterday at the New York Academy of Sciences on overnutrition, and it was more of a global world view of things, and we discussed that. And so how do you define healthy? So you could be otherwise obese and healthy, and sometimes people like to use that term, but are you really healthy? So maybe you're not insulin resistant now, maybe you're not diabetic now, maybe you don't have hypertension now, but your inflammatory markers are probably elevated. You probably have higher risk for other comorbidities. So I would argue that in the moment, you may be healthy by the measures that are being taken, but that in a global sense or in a long-term sense, that you're probably not healthy. Having said that, though, everybody that's obese does not get diabetes. But 90% of people that have diabetes, have type 2 diabetes, are obese. Everybody that's obese doesn't have hypertension. Some people have hypertension that are not obese, but it's all just increasing your risk factor. And I think the more we understand and the more things we measure, that I don't think we'll be saying that there's people that are obese but otherwise healthy. Yes?
Heard something about chia seeds, that chia seeds made you lose weight. But when I was in Walgreens the other day, they had some chia seeds, and I was reading on the back of them, and it said if you had trouble with diarrhea, do not use chia seeds. Is that how they make you lose weight?
So the question is, do chia seeds from Walgreens make you lose weight? Again, there's lots of anecdotal things. There's lots of books. There's lots of diets. There's the grapefruit diet, the cookie diet. Now there's the fireman's diet. All these things. Chia seeds. Just eating chia seeds. There's never been a study to show that they would actually cause you to lose weight. It doesn't say there might be some health benefit of it. They have some healthy fatty acids in them. If you enjoy them, I personally don't, but if you enjoy them and you want to eat small quantities of them, it's probably fine. But it's not a magic bullet as far as obesity. There's no science to support that.
I was thinking the rest of it.
That was actually part of the study that Dr. Lehman did at Fox. So,
Okay.
That's what I thought.
Okay.
Doing the study, that's the reason I asked.
Yeah, they did a study where they added on chia seeds just added on chia seeds to everyone's daily diet, and so to look at that. But there's not a mechanism, a scientific mechanism, and the hypothesis though that it's not that it would not be due to GI, but it would be due to other things in the chia seeds that may be helpful. Yes. So the question is, why are wild animals getting fatter? So anything I say will be wrong or right. I don't know. So you can understand domestic animals, and in fact, an interesting fact is that dogs body weight tracks more with their owners, whereas cats don't. It's just because probably cats are more aloof, but and maybe don't beg as much, but that's just kind of an interesting observation. But as far as wild animals are concerned, so some of the feral animals, like the rats and cats and things like that, it could very well be they're just exposed to more food. There's more garbage that's available, and they're able to eat that. If I want to really stick my neck out, I'll say it's global warming. So yes. So the question is, could the change in the food supply being grown in further places, exposed to more pesticides and things like that, could they be contributing to obesity? So as I showed you, there are some chemical compounds that do correlate, and there's some mechanisms for how they may lead to weight gain. I personally don't believe that is the sole change, because there's a lot of other things that happen with that. And also I think the fact that when you're growing things out, it gets to the activity thing as well. So when you grow things out in your own fields, you have to go work the fields, go collect them, and the types of food that you're eating. Most people don't grow refined candies and things in their yard. They're growing vegetables and things like that. So I think it can contribute, but I don't personally believe it's a major contributor. Yes.
You spoke about in utero growing fetus or child. I've heard that if children were breastfed, they were less likely to develop fat cells that developed into obesity later on. Any comment about that?
So, so the question is, do breastfed infants have lower propensity to become obese versus formula-fed? I have read studies like that as well, but I have to say that I don't know that data enough to say that that's necessarily true. And there's other circumstances around that as to whether, and you'd have to do a carefully controlled study to actually see that, because there may be other reasons why somebody's using formula, and the environment that they're in may be very different from somebody that's breastfeeding. So I believe it's probably a complicated answer.